All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're tackling one of the most frequently skipped and honestly misunderstood sections of the Old Testament. If you've ever tried reading through 1st and 2nd Kings or the Chronicles, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. It can feel like this endless, confusing list of ancient names. But today, we're going to look at the data in a completely new way. So here's our starting number. After King Solomon died, the unified nation of Israel tragically split into two factions. You had the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, called Judah. And across these two kingdoms, over a span of about 400 years, there were exactly 39 kings, 19 up in the north and 20 down in the south.
Now be honest with me. Can you name more than 5 of them? Most of us absolutely can't. And you know, there's a good reason for that. We tend to mistakenly read these books as a dry, tedious list of dates, military campaigns, and totally unpronounceable names that goes absolutely nowhere. We treat it like a dusty history textbook, which makes it incredibly easy to just skip right over.
Part 1, the hidden historical pattern. But there's a hidden pattern here that turns this history into a thrilling mystery. Today, we're going to uncover 4 key pieces: the measuring stick, the northern downfall, how good kings stop short, and finally, the evidence for a king.
To really get this, we need a major paradigm shift. As modern readers, we instinctively judge our leaders on political success, right? Winning wars, booming economies, building huge cities. But the biblical writers, they completely ignore those metrics. They evaluate every single one of these 39 kings using only one singular standard: covenant faithfulness. Basically, did they honor the covenant God made with Israel? Part 2. One ultimate measuring stick. So let's examine the exact, unchanging theological formula used to evaluate every single one of those 39 reigns. This specific verdict is given to every single king with absolutely no exceptions. He did what was right, or he did what was evil. This one singular sentence completely flips the books of Kings and Chronicles into covenant assessment documents rather than your standard history books. The writers are really just asking one pastoral question: is Israel walking with God, or are they walking away from him? The crucial point here is that God's perspective was literally the only metric that mattered when assessing these human leaders. Notice how the text purposefully says, "in the sight of the Lord." It doesn't say in the sight of the people or by the standards of international politics. Human opinion was completely irrelevant to the final verdict. Let's look at the hard data for the Northern Kingdom. It lasted 209 years, and an astounding 0 out of 19 kings did what was right. Not a single one. It's a 100% failure rate. Every single northern king led the people away from God. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast with the southern kingdom of Judah. Judah survived an extra 136 years, and their record looks a little bit different. Out of 20 kings, they had a mix: 8 good kings who did what was right, and 12 evil ones. So, why was the north such an unmitigated disaster? Part 3. The Northern Kingdom's downfall. Let's see how this 100% failure rate built a culture of absolute apostasy, starting right from day one. It all kicked off with their very first king, Jeroboam. When the kingdom split, Jeroboam was terrified his people would travel south to the temple in Jerusalem and, switch their loyalty back to the south. So he built 2 golden calves purely as a political maneuver to control the population. He set them up in Bethel and Dan and basically told them, hey, it's way too far for you to go all the way to Jerusalem. That one political decision poisoned the northern kingdom forever. In fact, the sin of Jeroboam is mentioned 17 times as the absolute template for every wicked king that followed him. Now, if Jeroboam set the template, King Ahab and Jezebel pushed it to the absolute extreme. They created a state-sponsored cult to the god Baal. This is exactly why the prophet Elijah shows up with maximum intensity. But what's totally fascinating is that even Ahab, arguably the worst king of the north, showed a brief moment of genuine humility that God actually noticed. It really shows us these weren't just cartoon villains, they were complicated humans making catastrophic choices. The ultimate tragedy of the north was that even when they tried to fix things, it was always a halfway reform. Take King Jehu, for example. He forcefully eliminated Ahab's Baal worship. That's step 1. But step 2, he left the root issue totally intact. He kept Jeroboam's golden calves. This kind of repentance that never quite reached the root eventually led to step 3. By 722 BC, they weren't just defeated by the Assyrian Empire, they were abandoned by the covenant partner they had rejected. Samaria fell, and the 10 tribes were scattered. Part 4. Judah's good kings stop short. As we turn our attention back down south, we see the Southern Kingdom's record is much more complicated and reveals a fascinating generational roller coaster.
This timeline perfectly shows how wholehearted reform was constantly followed by catastrophic reversal. Just look at this whiplash. You have an incredible king like Hezekiah, who relies completely on God. But then he's immediately followed by Manasseh, who spends 55 years undoing all of that good. Then comes Josiah, who leads a massive, sweeping reform, only for the final 4 kings to plunge the nation right back into evil, which ultimately ends in the Babylonian exile. The righteousness of one generation simply could not guarantee the faithfulness of the next.
But look closely at those 8 good kings of the south. Almost every single one came with a massive qualifying flaw. Do you notice a pattern here? Asa and Jehoshaphat did right, but left the unauthorized high places intact. Joash was only faithful while his mentor lived. They definitely made progress, but they all stopped short of completion. There were rare exceptions who went all the way, though, like King Hezekiah. Hezekiah boldly smashed the unauthorized high places. He literally destroyed the bronze serpent Moses had made centuries earlier because the people had turned it into an idol. And when the massive, terrifying Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, telling them their God was weak, Hezekiah didn't surrender. He laid the threatening letter out in the temple and prayed. He didn't just pray for personal survival, he prayed that God would save them to protect God's own reputation among the nations. And that single, selfless prayer stopped an empire. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers fell, and Jerusalem was saved.
But then the roller coaster plunges again. Tragically, Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, took the throne and ruled for 55 years, literally the longest reign in their history. And he rebuilt everything his father had destroyed. He practiced sorcery, sacrificed his own son in the fire, and the text says he actually did more evil than the Canaanites. His reign was so catastrophically wicked that it permanently set Judah on an irreversible path to destruction. Just one generation of bad leadership destroyed everything.
A few generations later, King Josiah tried to save the nation. When he was 26, priests doing temple renovations found a scroll. It was the Book of the Law. It hadn't just been misplaced, it had been completely lost and forgotten by the entire nation. When Josiah heard it read, he tore his clothes in grief and launched the most comprehensive, wholehearted reform in their history. But tragically, his momentum died with him when he was killed in battle at just 39 years old. Within 23 years of his death, Babylon burned Jerusalem to the ground. Part 5, Evidence for a Future King. So, what is the point of all this tragedy? Let's look at the ultimate conclusion of what the biblical writers are actually trying to tell us through this 400-year historical record. The pattern powerfully reveals the fundamental limits of human kings. No human leader, no matter how righteous, not even Josiah or Hezekiah, can sustain faithfulness across generations. They can't guarantee their children won't reverse their reforms. They definitely cannot outlast their own death. Quite simply, a human king is entirely insufficient to carry the perfect weight of the divine covenant. So, the grand takeaway is that the failure of these 39 kings isn't just a depressing history lesson, it's actually a profound 400-year theological argument. Every failed reform and every wicked turn is evidence validating the prophet Isaiah's urgent promise. Surrounded by these failing human kings, Isaiah promised a coming, everlasting king, a wonderful counselor, a prince of peace whose government and peace would have no end. The 39 kings proved exactly why that permanent king was an absolute necessity.
I'll leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Where in our own lives do we settle for flawed, temporary human solutions? Where do we put our ultimate trust in human leadership when we should be looking to the ultimate throne? The history of these 39 kings reminds us that human leadership is always provisional. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. See you on the next explainer.